As the weeks passed, however, I accepted aloneness as a way of life, and I was no longer lonely. I was utterly absorbed in the work, fascinated by the chimps, too busy in the evenings to brood. In fact, had I been alone for longer than a year, I might have become a rather strange person, for inanimate objects began to develop their own identities. I found myself saying, "Good morning," to my little hut on the peak, "Hello," to the stream where I collected my water. And I became immensely aware of the trees. Just to feel the roughness of a gnarled trunk or the cold smoothness of young bark with my hand filled me with a strange knowledge of the roots under the ground and the pulsing sap within. I longed to be able to swing through the branches like the chimps, to sleep in the treetops lulled by the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. In particular, I loved to sit in a forest when it was raining and to hear the pattering of the drops on the leaves and feel utterly enclosed in a dim twilight world of greens and browns and dampness. I shall always remember going in the little boat from the nearest town of Kigoma along the shore of Lake Tanganyika towards the Gombe National Park. It was a game reserve at that time. And I was with my mother. I was told by the English authorities we can't have a young English girl going out in the bush alone. And so I had to choose a companion that would be compatible and congenial. I chose my mother. She came. And I looked up at the forested slopes of the mountains. And I can vividly remember, as though it's yesterday, thinking, well, how am I going to find the chimpanzees? And landing on the shore, stepping onto the sand, seeing the Africans who lived there, who greeted us, getting the tent up, and then taking that first walk by myself up the slopes into the forest, and still feeling this is going to be a tough job, but at the same time thinking, this is what my life is all about. This is what I've always wanted, and I'm jolly well going to succeed somehow.
And succeed she did. For Dr. Jane Goodall, now recognized around the world as the leading authority on chimpanzee behavior, success is counted sweetest by those who want it the most, endure the longest, and dedicate themselves to triumphs beyond their personal gain. When on July 14, 1960, at the age of 26, Jane Goodall arrived at the Gombe Stream Chimpanzee Reserve on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania, Africa, she was hardly prepared physically, emotionally, or academically for the arduous tasks ahead. At the time, many people criticized anthropologist Louis Leakey's selection of an untrained young woman to undertake the long-term study of chimpanzees in the wild. Many felt that Miss Goodall would not last more than a few months. Yet what Jane Goodall lacked in experience, she compensated for by determination. Amazingly, she has now devoted all or at least a part of every year since that naive beginning in 1960 to her studies at Gombe. She is now in her 30th consecutive year. As a testimonial to human steadfastness and courage in the pursuit of knowledge, Jane Goodall's life and career are remarkable.
My childhood was spent in England. I was born in London. We moved just outside London when I was very small. Then we went to France. I was supposed to grow up speaking French, but the war came, so back to England. And there I really grew up in my grandmother's home, my mother's mother, in Bournemouth. And right from the beginning, even before I got there, I was fascinated by animals. I would watch insects, and this love of animals and fascination for animals, I don't know where it came from, but I had it for as long as I can remember. I didn't know my father very well because my parents were divorced when I was 8, and before that my father had been in the war. But I have had a very special relationship with my mother all my life. She's a fantastic person. She's now well over 80, but she's still helping me tremendously with all that I do. She helped me raise my son, and I just think that my relationship with her has helped me to keep a very good perspective on life.
The young Goodall spent most of her time and money learning about the local birds and other animals. She later attended the Uplands Private School near Bournemouth, where she took a general certificate of education. After she graduated from secondary school, Miss Goodall worked first as a secretary at Oxford University, and then as an assistant at a documentary film company in London. These jobs were only stopgaps, however, for she had resolved when she was only 8 years old that someday she must study wild animals in Africa. Therefore, when a friend invited Jane to visit her in Kenya, Jane Goodall accepted immediately. It was famed anthropologist and paleontologist Louis Leakey who made her childhood dream possible.
I went to Kenya when I was 23. I saved up money to get there. We didn't have any money in my family at that time. And soon after I'd arrived to stay with a school friend, I heard about Louis Leakey. Somebody said, "Jane, if you're interested in animals, you must meet Louis Leakey." At that time, he was curator of the Natural History Museum in Nairobi. I called up on the phone and I said, "I'd like to speak to Dr. Leakey." And a gruff voice snapped back, "I'm Leakey, what do you want?" So it took me a little aback, but I said I really wanted to meet him and talk about what I might do to work with animals. So he set up an appointment and we clicked. He asked me a lot of questions, and because of my reading I was able to answer most of them, I suppose in a satisfactory way. He offered me a job as his secretary assistant, and I had learned shorthand and typing, which was one of the most useful things I ever learned. And I also said to him, "Dr. Leakey, I think this is going to be a wonderful opportunity, but before I settle down in an office, even an office as wonderful as your room in the museum, I've got to get out and see the animals in the countryside of Africa."
Dr. Leakey offered Jane the chance to work with him and his wife Mary, searching for fossils at Olduvai Gorge. But he quickly became convinced that Jane was quite determined indeed to work with animals in the wild.
And I think it was after about a month that Louis Leakey began to realize that I truly didn't care about the amenities of civilization. I didn't care about hairdressers. I didn't want parties. And he started talking about some chimpanzees living on a distant lake shore. And I really didn't know why he was talking about them. And in the end I said, "Oh, Louis, I wish you wouldn't, because don't you know that's just the kind of thing I've always wanted to do?" And so he said, "Well, why do you think I'm talking about it?" And I was amazed because I had no qualifications then, at least no formal academic qualifications. But he felt that it was very important that I had an uncluttered mind, that I wasn't biased by scientific theory, and that I would go out to do that rather tough job because I wanted to learn about chimps.
At first, Miss Goodall's lack of formal academic training was not a problem. Her plan was simply to locate the chimpanzees and observe their activities as often as possible. Day after day, 7 days a week, from sunrise to sunset, she watched and recorded her observations, endeavoring to move closer whenever possible and to be accepted by the chimps.
The first task I had to do was to find where the chimps were, where I was likely to see them. The next and hardest task I've ever had at Gombe was to get the chimpanzees to accept me at all. You know, at first they would run off even if I was 500 meters away. But I developed the technique of sitting on this high peak overlooking two valleys with my binoculars, wearing the same colored clothes so that I would look part of the landscape that didn't change, and gradually piecing together the chimps' behavior from a distance, writing down everything I saw. I didn't have any set plan, I just wanted to learn. And there were no techniques really developed at that time. It wasn't the sort of thing that many people went off and did. But I'd always had patience. I'd always watched animals. I'd always written about them. It was really a continuation of what I'd done all my life as a child.
The initial period of fear and hasty retreat by the chimps was followed by about 5 months of aggression and hostility. Gradually, Miss Goodall began to recognize and name individual chimpanzees. One particularly approachable male, whom she called David Greybeard, was observed eating piglet. Previously, scientists had not known that chimpanzees would hunt and devour larger mammals. Later, David Greybeard's entrance into her camp and his filching some bananas marked a turning point in her studies. Soon she was able to approach and work more closely with many other chimps, both in camp and up in the mountains as well.
The first close relationship that I developed with a chimp was, of course, David Greybeard, way back in 1961. And I don't know why he tolerated my approaching him so closely, so long before the others. But he did. And I'll always remember the day when very first I actually reached out, holding him a palm nut in my outstretched hand. And he didn't want the nut, but he took it, and as he dropped it to the ground, he just gently held my hand. And quite clearly I interpreted that as a gesture of reassurance. He didn't want the nut, but he didn't want to hurt me either. It was a friendly gesture, and it spoke right through the species barrier. I knew exactly what he meant intuitively, and that was a very wonderful moment.
During her first stint in the wild, Jane Goodall made tedious but considerable progress in gaining the trust of the animals. She also created a practical plan of scientific study that would eventually foster many new insights into the behavior of chimpanzees in the wild. Nevertheless, her lack of a formal university education left her feeling uneasy. So she applied and became only the 8th person without a bachelor's degree ever to be admitted to a PhD program at Cambridge University. At Cambridge, Miss Goodall worked with Professor Robert A. Hind, completing her PhD in ethology in 1965. Professor Hind recalls his relationship with Jane Goodall as a mutual sharing of experiences.
Well, my role with Jane really came about through Louis Leakey. He started Jane off on studies of monkeys in East Africa, and then started her on the chimpanzee project at Gombe. And after she'd been there a short while, he felt that she needed some scientific training. And my role was really to teach her scientific method. I didn't know anything about chimpanzees at that time. And I spent many marvelous days with Jane learning about chimpanzees from her. It was, I feel, looking back, both with her and with Diane Fossey, it was a two-way relationship that I had, in which I taught them a certain amount about scientific procedure and record keeping and precision and all that, and they taught me a great deal about animals.
Indeed, Dr. Goodall has taught the world a great deal about animals, particularly about chimpanzee social structure and behavior. For example, we now realize that uniquely among non-human primates, chimps interact within groups of approximately 50 other members of their species called communities. Individuals of either sex have almost complete freedom to come and go as they wish, except that females, once they have given birth, have little or no time alone. For the most part, chimps typically travel around in smaller parties, consisting of a mother, her offspring, and any males that might wander in and out. The father plays no role in the family after conception, but the mother and offspring may stay together for years. In one especially pathetic case, Flint, offspring of the matriarch Flo in her later years, never developed a normal independency from his mother. When Flo died, Flint seemed utterly shattered, became ill, and died just 3 weeks later.
One of the most fascinating aspects of chimp behavior for me has always been the relationship between a mother and her growing offspring. The bond between a mother and her child is very strong. Chimpanzee mothers are typically affectionate, playful, tolerant. They carry the child on the belly, subsequently on the back, build a nest which the child shares with them at night. They share food with the child, and they protect them in all kinds of social and environmental dangerous situations. The bond is so close that if a mother dies before the child is weaned, this can have very disastrous consequences for the child. They are emotionally shattered, and in some cases will appear to pine away and die as a result of losing the mother, even though they're more or less independent as far as nutrition is concerned.
Another aspect of chimpanzee behavior witnessed by Dr. Goodall was the struggle for male dominance, which frequently ended in violence. One humorous episode with a chimp named Mike demonstrated the individuality of the animal's responses.
Mike was characterized, first of all, by a tremendous desire to raise his social rank, and secondly, by an unusual intelligence. The male chimp typically maintains or enhances his position in the hierarchy by means of the charging display, which is a very dramatic display where the male charges across the ground, sometimes upright, sometimes on all fours, picks up rocks and hurls them, drags branches, shakes the vegetation, makes himself look bigger and more dangerous than he may actually be, and may thus intimidate his rival without risking an actual fight. And Mike made use of empty kerosene cans, 4-gallon kerosene cans, that he found lying around by my tent. And he learned to incorporate up to 3 of these cans into one of his charging displays. He would keep them ahead of him, hitting and kicking, and he would go directly towards other males who were at that time his superiors, and there were 10 of them then. And of course they would get out of the way of this racketing approach. And after a 4-month period, Mike was able to intimidate all the others and reach that top-ranking position, as far as we know, without a single fight. And what's really important to emphasize here is that all the males had the opportunity to use those cans. All of them had used at least one at least once, but only Mike had been able to capitalize on that chance experience and turn it to his own good.
In fact, Dr. Goodall recognized that chimpanzees can think, act creatively, and relate by means of a fairly sophisticated communication system.
Well, the chimpanzees have a very rich repertoire of sounds, vocal communication sounds, and these are given in particular contexts, and quite clearly they mean different things and can be interpreted as such by chimpanzees listening. In fact, we have a very major study ongoing at the moment with a linguistic social anthropologist professor from Northern Kentucky University, Dr. Christopher Bohm. Some of the sounds, well, the distance call, the call which enables the scattered groups in the community to maintain contact with each other over the whole width of a valley, the panthoot. Not only does it carry, but every chimp has his or her own individual voice. So when you hear that sound, if you're another chimp, you know not just there's a chimp there, friend or foe there, but exactly who it is who's calling. And this is interesting because it means that the hearer can then make a decision. Do I reply? Do I remain quiet? Do I go and join that chimp or those chimps? Do I stay where I am? Do I retreat hastily in another direction? And that is so characteristic and so typical of chimpanzee social life. They're always having to make decisions just because of the fluid nature of the society.
Certainly the most significant observation of chimp behavior made by Dr. Goodall, however, and the discovery that has radically altered our understanding of the relationship between chimps and humans, is the ability of chimpanzees to make and use tools. Previously, humans had been considered the only tool-making and tool-using animals.
The first time I saw tool using and tool making at Gombe was after the first 4 months. I was hidden. The chimps, to start with anyway, didn't know I was there. Again, it was David Greybeard with his friend Goliath. And it was really exciting. I could see the grass blades. I was having difficulty seeing exactly what was happening because I was behind a tree, some vegetation. I could see the hand moving. I could see the termite mound. And I knew they had to be using tools, but somehow I couldn't believe it. And I'd been visited by George Schaller, who'd been with the mountain gorillas just about a month before. And he had said to me, well, Jane, if you can see tool using or meat eating, that will just be fantastic. And after the 2 chimps had wandered away, I went to the termite heap and I saw these stems lying there, and I saw the termites on the surface of the heap. And I picked up one of the grasses and pushed it into the hole, and the termites bit on. So I knew then exactly what they'd been doing. It was really exciting. The chimps at Gombe use the straws and twigs to fish for termites more than they use any other type of tool. And they do sometimes pick a leafy twig and strip the leaves off, or pick a thick blade of grass and trim it. In other words, they modify the object and thus actually make a tool. And that was a tremendously exciting moment for Louis Leakey. I sent him a telegram, and he said to my mother, he said, well, now Jane's seen this. This means we have to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. And as the years went by, I was able to see other kinds of tool use, one of which was to pick a handful of leaves, to crumple them by chewing them in the mouth, and then to use this as a kind of homemade sponge to sop up water that's collected in a hollow in a tree trunk, which can't be reached with the lips. And I think one of the most fascinating things about chimp tool use is that in every area where chimps have been studied, there are completely different tool-using traditions, which we can define as primitive cultures.
That chimpanzees can make and use primitive tools is strong evidence of their close kinship to the human species. But there are many other similarities. While chimps often maintain peaceful relationships for days, like humans, they can also demonstrate anger and sudden violence, even to the point of the murder of an individual by group attack.
Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. We're told that genetically the DNA of humans and chimpanzees differs by only just over 1%. The structure, the anatomy of the chimpanzee brain resembles that of the human brain more than does that of any other living creature. What fascinates me most, of course, is similarities in social behavior, because that's my field. And here we see such remarkable similarities, such as the long-term bonds between family members, supportive and affectionate, that can last through life. The fact that chimpanzees can cooperate when they're hunting and share food. The fact that they use more objects for a greater variety of purposes as tools than any other creature except ourselves. Perhaps most fascinating of all is the similarity in some of their non-verbal communication gestures, such as kissing, holding hands, patting one another on the back. And it's not only that the gestures are the same, it's the contexts in which they use these gestures, which are often exactly the same as the contexts in which we use them. And then it's true to say that everybody who's worked closely with chimps in any kind of normal situation for a number of years will concur that chimpanzees share a wide range of emotions, which are probably similar to or even identical to human emotions that we label joy and sorrow, rage, fear, despair, terror, and so on. And finally, research both in the field and perhaps particularly in some of the psychology labs have shown that a lot of cognitive abilities that we used to think completely unique to our own species are present also in chimps. They can reason, they can to some extent plan for the immediate future. They have fantastic memories, particularly for places and people. They can understand and use abstract symbols in their communication. They have a concept of self. They have a sense of humor.
Because chimpanzees are so akin to humans, they are frequently used in medical research. Unfortunately, the chimps are often kept alone in tiny, bare, and sterile cages, a problem that Dr. Goodall has dedicated her personal efforts and reputation to correct.
Chimps have been used in learning about hepatitis B and in developing a vaccine. The major use in most places for them today is for testing batches of hepatitis B virus and for investigating the nature of hepatitis non-A, non-B, and of course AIDS. And what is so totally shocking to me is not so much the fact that people will use these animals because they're so like us. It's the conditions in which they're maintained, which in so many cases are totally inhumane. And this, of course, is becoming more and more apparent as we learn more and more the extent to which the chimp resembles us, not just physiologically, which is why they're used, but also emotionally and intellectually. I personally think that we were incredibly arrogant to assume in the first place that animals were there for us to use whatever we want them for, whether it's intensive farming, so we change grass and meal into meat, or whether it's to kill them to take their fur, or whether it's to use them to test our drugs and our perfumes and our cosmetics. And unfortunately, too many people just know a little bit and they react too violently in the wrong way, and they haven't got all the facts, and they can be ridiculed by the scientists. And the goodwill of those people is deflected. So we have to do a lot more educating of people in a rational way.
Because of her determination, perseverance, and courage, Dr. Jane Goodall has made many important contributions to our awareness of the animal world around us. She has authored numerous highly regarded articles and books, including the best-selling In the Shadow of Man, and she has received many honorary degrees and awards. In addition, she is actively involved in the Jane Goodall Institute for Wildlife Research, Education, and Conservation. The Institute's chief goals include preserving chimpanzees in the wild, continuing Dr. Goodall's research into wild chimpanzee behavior, educating school children and the general public about chimpanzee-related issues, and working with zoos and labs in the United States and Europe to improve living conditions for our nearest relative. But perhaps Dr. Goodall's ultimate message, and what may be the most critical counsel she or any other scientist can share with the public, concerns our willingness to live in harmony with our fellow human beings and all other living creatures as well.
I think one of the major contributions that the chimpanzee research at Gombe has made to science has been to point to the fact that humans do not stand in isolated splendor, separated from the rest of the animal kingdom. We are different, we are unique, we have developed a spoken language, we can bounce ideas back and forth. The chimps can't do that. We have intellectual capacities that dwarf even the most gifted chimpanzee, but nevertheless, differences between us on the one hand and chimpanzees on the other, I think, are differences of degree rather than of kind. And I think we've blurred the sharp barrier that used to be drawn between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom as a result of getting to better understand chimpanzees.
She's done, I think, a tremendous job in awakening people's imagination about the beauty of nature, the importance of nature, the realities of the natural world. And that's very important, not only from the point of view of conserving the animals themselves, but for people's general attitude to the world, to conservation, and to all the problems that are now confronting the human beings.